Good morning. How's everyone doing? Do we need some cafecito? ¿Dónde está la cafecito? All right. Well, look, very excited for this next discussion. But before we kick this off, we're going to have a couple more sessions and then hit off for our networking lunch. But I want to recognize some folks in the room that are here, a number of former ambassadors, a number of ministers. So we highly encourage you to come, but definitely want to give a shout out to some representatives from the Department of War who are here supporting our security in the Western Hemisphere. For this next speaker, I'm excited to introduce Joseph Humire. Joseph is the Assistant Secretary of War for Homeland Defense and America's Security Affairs, where he is overseeing U.S. defense policy across the Western Hemisphere. Before that, he served in a number of roles, most notably the founder of the Center for Secure Free Society, visiting fellow at Heritage Foundation, as well as a fellow at the America First Policy Institute. Having just left the Pentagon working with ASW Humire, excited to hear kind of his vision for the region. So please join me in welcoming Assistant Secretary of War, Joseph Humire.
Okay, good morning, buenos dias. So first, I'd be remiss if I didn't begin by thanking Randy, FIU. This is the 11th symposium, and you guys were lucky because you guys got Randy back. We tried to keep him, but you guys got him back, and Randy did a great job for us at the department, working on a range of priority issues from Mexico to Haiti to other things. So thank you, Randy, for everything that you've done for the country, for the administration, and obviously for the Western Hemisphere. So I'll begin a little bit with why I don't actually speak publicly too much because I'm not in a really public job, but I'll begin kind of why I'm here. And I'm here, well, one, because Randy invited me, but also I'm here for one very simple reason. I'm here because under the leadership of President Trump, under the leadership of Secretary of War Pete Hegseth, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and the entire leadership team in the U.S. government, we are changing history. For everyone that's been working on the Western Hemisphere, and I count myself, because those that know me in my previous life, I've been doing Western Hemisphere work for going on about 20 years, and we would dream of when the day would come when the country would take it seriously, right? I'm sure those of you, this 11th conference, I'm sure many times you've done this conference, you said, well, one day the United States will take it seriously. In fact, I'm here also in Miami because we just have a meeting with the ambassadors at Southern Command. And I think Secretary of State Marco Rubio, he said something to us yesterday that kind of stuck with me. And he said, like, you know, taking the Western Hemisphere seriously was almost like telling your parents telling your kids to eat your vegetables. Like, you know it's good for you, you know you're supposed to do it, but for whatever reason, it just never happens, right? But well, we're here. And we have now prioritized the Western Hemisphere in ways that we have never done before. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about for the next few minutes. I'm going to talk to you about how we've done that, what we're doing, where we're going, and hopefully that's useful to everybody here in the room. So what's the secret sauce? Like, why is the Western Hemisphere more important today than it's ever been in the past? And I'm going to give you like a little bit of like harsh reality. So someone's probably going to disagree with me, and so please, like, you know, be kind and gentle. But the reason is it's not trade. Trade's important, and you need trade, right? But let's be brutally honest with the numbers. Latin America and the Caribbean, if you take out Mexico and Canada, like the big trade partners, the rest of Latin America and the Caribbean is 7% of global trade, right? It's 5% of global manufacturing. It's 6% of shifting demographics. So I can come out and give you 10,000 arguments of why there's a promise of trade and they have all these natural resources, but the business mentality of the investors and the major market actors, those numbers don't lie. You go to Asia, it's 50, 60, 70%, right? The market moves to where there's a demand signal. So I do think one day, if we do our jobs right today, Latin America will become a hub for international trade and you know, nearshoring, you know, all that stuff. But it's not today. The reason why the Western Hemisphere is the #1 priority for the United States is because of U.S. Homeland Defense. This is the basic common knowledge. Our shared geography It's why. Because, like, those numbers, if you put it anywhere else in the world, and, like, the United States just won't care. But you put it next to us, and it's not good. Because everything bad that happens in Latin America, the Caribbean, or in the Western Hemisphere at large, eventually reaches our borders. And I think that was more evidenced to what has happened in the last several years prior to President Trump assuming office in January 2025. But in just 14 months, well, actually now 15, 16 months, so this is like an older remark, but in just a year and a half, I think we've been able to reverse the tide. I think we're now starting to win inside the Western Hemisphere in ways that we haven't done in the past. And its commitment to win under President Trump is to put America first, to put Americans first, and obviously put the Americas first in our U.S. foreign policy and national security. So how does this begin? So when I joined the Pentagon about a year and a half ago, when I joined the Pentagon, my first job was actually not Western Hemisphere. My first job was Homeland. My first job was the Southwest border. And if you work on Western Hemisphere issues and you haven't studied what has happened to our Southwest border, you're missing the point. You know, the crisis that we had on our Southwest border in the previous administration, whether it's record illegal crossings, I mean, upwards of 12,000 illegal crossings a day, when the border only has a capacity in terms of personnel and infrastructure to handle about 2,000, or it's the amount of deadly drugs that are coming into our country, killing our American citizens, fentanyl for sure, but cocaine in and of itself would kill about 35,000 Americans per year. So that was the initial thing, is we have to put an end to that border. Matter of fact, in previous administrations, all these record numbers, whether it's illegal crossings or drugs, we were breaking records for all the wrong things, and it wasn't going to be sustainable. So when President Trump came in, he said, we're going to put a stop to that. My first trip as a appointed official was to our Southwest border. I went with Randy, and we went to Arizona, Fort Huachuca, near to where we had one of these things called a National Defense Area. And the logic of the National Defense Area, we have 6 now, all throughout the 1,954-mile border. About 43% of the border is covered by U.S. military installations called National Defense Areas that works in partnership with federal law enforcement. And how we did that was basically, if you look at this 2,000-mile border, you start to put National Defense Areas in places where law enforcement has less an ability to detain, to surveil, to control. Then you allow law enforcement to concentrate on the major ports of entries so their capacity doesn't get taxed. That's the logic of it. It's basically squeezing that balloon, right? And if it didn't work, we wouldn't have gone from 2 to 6. We would have probably stopped and done something else. But the numbers speak for themselves. I mean, we turned record levels of mass illegal migration to the lowest recorded border encounters in the history of the United States since numbers have been encountered. So that's how we did this. And so once the numbers of illegal crossings to the Southwest border started going down, and that happened relatively quickly. I got to argue almost it happened a little too quick because people just like, okay, that's done, move on to the next thing. I was like, wait, that's still you know, as the White House and Homeland Security Council always reminds me, that's not 100%. So we have to do more. But once we started looking at those numbers going down, we started looking at the deaths of American citizens to deadly drugs. Obviously, fentanyl is at the core of that. You know, fentanyl has been classified as a weapon of mass destruction. There's over 100,000 Americans that perish, many times young Americans, your children, your neighbors. These are the Americans that are getting killed. And then there's the drug trafficking organizations, and now what we call designated terrorist organizations that is moving those deadly drugs into our border and across our borders. And so once we looked at the border numbers, we started looking at the overdose death numbers. This is the President of the United States looking at these numbers and saying, I need to see a reduction. So we start looking at the mass amount of drugs coming in the maritime environment. You probably heard of Operation Southern Spear, which was launched last year and is ongoing to today. Well, if you look at it like this, think of the same logic that I explained about the Southwest border, right? About the squeezing and to be able to concentrate, to build capacity, to deter, seal, and repel. That same logic is applied to the maritime environment. If you look at the maritime environment in Latin America and the Western Hemisphere of things that move south to north, it's called, I look at it as a 4-lane cocaine superhighway, right? You have the Eastern Caribbean, the Central Caribbean, the Western Caribbean, and the Eastern Pacific. That's the cocaine superhighway. Well, we began to shut off some of those lanes. We began with the Eastern Caribbean because, frankly, it's not where all the bulk of that percentage-wise of those drugs are flowing, but it probably was, in some ways, I don't want to say easy, but it was like the easier to start to shut off because of shorter distances. The biggest one is the Eastern Pacific. That's the mega cocaine super lane in the cocaine superhighway. Well, we also began Eastern Pacific operations, and we did it with partners all along the way. In the beginning, it was the United States, but then we started to motivate some of our partners. So what I'd like to do for the next few minutes is kind of dispel some of the myths that I've been hearing about Operation Southern Spear or about our efforts in the maritime environment. The first thing I constantly hear about, well, why are you going after cocaine when it's fentanyl that's killing all the Americans, right? That's the number one thing you probably hear, despite the fact that I mentioned that there is a lot of significant overdose deaths by cocaine alone, and then there's a lot once you mix cocaine with fentanyl, that becomes like even more deadly because it's disguised. Well, the truth is, we're not going after cocaine and fentanyl only. We're not just going after the commodity. We're going after that designated terrorist organization, and that goes back to January 20th of 2025 when the president made that key executive order, one of the first that he signed, to designate cartels as major terrorist organizations. Later in February, the Department of State actually did the classification, February of last year. So we're going after the organizational structures. Because I have news for everybody here. It's something you Western Hemisphere experts already know. The Mexican cartels or the Mexican terrorist organizations did not build their business on fentanyl. They built their business on cocaine. And cocaine is still the driver of how those organizational structures operate. Today is fentanyl. Tomorrow will be some other synthetic. But we're dismantling and we're destroying those organizations as they exist. So they're not going to be trafficking anything. They could try to traffic avocados, and it's not going to work. Because we're going to dismantle those organizations across the board. There's upwards of 15, and I might be off on a number too, but there's upward of 15 major cartels that have been designated as designated terrorist organizations. And these cartels don't live on an island, right? They're transnational by nature, so they hop around. The Mexican cartels in themselves, the Mexican DTOs, operate in at least 10 countries throughout the world, if not more, and many inside our hemisphere. The second myth that I want to dispel is that these operations, and we get a lot of this from the Hill, from our friends in the Congress, but these operations aren't transparent. The striking of the vessels in the maritime environment, they say, oh, it's not transparent enough, you're not giving us, it's on TV. So I don't know, I'm not, I've been in the military before. It's probably one of the most transparent military operations I've ever seen in my life. Literally, after you get down to the command center, you get upstairs and it's already on Twitter or X. It's pretty, they're showing the videos. It's pretty, and the funny thing is, we carried out these type of counterterrorism operations in other parts of the world, notably in the Middle East. I never remember anyone asking, who were the Yemeni fishermen that were operating in the Gulf of Yemen before you struck that? You kind of know these are terrorist organizations, they're doing terrorist things, we got to go after it. But somehow when it gets closer to our shores, it becomes like a novelty, or and that's logic to me is it gets lost upon me, because if it's closer to our shores, it's actually probably more important, it's probably more worrisome, and we probably want our military to act a little bit more aggressively. But the reality is that they're very transparent operations. They're operations that have been briefed both at the classified level and at the unclassified level by our leadership, most notably the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth. And we're adding layers of transparency, and fundamentally, we're adding layers to do partner-led deterrence-focused operations. I point to everyone to pay attention to what's going on in Ecuador. Ecuador has now decided to use its military to go after the fight with the cartels, and it's not the only solution. This is a force multiplier to interdictions and seizures of the normal way of going after these major cartels. But here's the reality. We've been doing that for 20, 30, maybe longer years, and barely make a dent. So deterrence is sending a signal. It's complementing federal law enforcement. It's about sending a message to these cartels. You're elevating their risk of activity to complement all the law enforcement efforts that are still ongoing today. The other myth is that they're fishermen, right? They're the nice fishermen on twin turbojet motors sailing around the Caribbean looking for that big fish that they have to get. And I don't know how he really addressed that, other than I say the same intelligence and targeting that we use to go after terrorist organizations in other parts of the world is the same methods that we're using here. It's very professional. The United States does this probably better than any other country in the world. Targeting. For those that are in the business, you know how targeters work. And targeters are very methodical, they're very meticulous, and they work within an interagency. So that's how these things are getting worked. And, are they fishermen? I mean, sure. I mean, maybe one's a fisherman, but fundamentally they're trafficking not fish. They're trafficking other things, and they're connected to or belong to one of the designated terrorist organizations that have been listed as such. I mean, if my neighbor is like a good guy on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, but he's like massacring people on Thursday, Friday, it still makes him my neighbor, but he's actually, someone should probably do something about that. And the results are there. We're starting to see a diminished movement in vessels from these two lanes, the Eastern Pacific and the Eastern Caribbean, allowing law enforcement to concentrate on the Western and Central Caribbean and start to get more, and then inspiring our partners to do more. And we were having that conversation, actually, the last time I was in Doral, in Miami, I was at a conference that we put together, led by the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, called the America's Counter Cartel Coalition, ACCC. I think some of you were there, actually, for that. And that's where we launched a coalition of 18 members, including the United States, of countries that have decided to join the fight with us. They say, we've been dealing with this. You know the number one thing I get when I talk to these countries? It's not like, oh, we don't know about the sovereign. They're like, what took you so long? Like, this is a problem for your country. This is a problem for our country. Why wasn't the United States taking this serious enough? They've been waiting for this. And so we've given them that platform to be able to elevate their partnership with the United States. And I'm looking to have other countries join the America's Counter Cartel Coalition. The Department of War wants to work with other countries, but they have to show that will and capacity to go after the problem set. But the other myth, and this is probably the biggest myth that I've been hearing, is this another forever endless war? Are we getting ourselves into another long, drawn-out military campaign? I'll start by saying defending the homeland is not a mission that you just turn on and turn off. Defending the homeland is a permanent state for the United States because we constantly have threats that are coming from all angles and from all areas and domains. But this isn't the war on drugs. This isn't what you might have heard in the past. This isn't, like I said, we're not attacking the commodity. We're attacking the actual structures of these organizations. And a lot of people just don't think we could win. And that's actually, I think, part of this, right? A lot of countries in Latin America gave up. They just frankly said, you know what? They got too much money. We're just not gonna win. What's the saying? If you can't beat them, join them, right? Some countries decided to go that route. Part of what we're doing is showing you that we are gonna win. And you know when we found out we're gonna win? We know when we showed the world that we can win? On January 3rd, 2026. When we, through only the United States military, carried out one of the most sophisticated, complex, and successful joint operations in support of law enforcement to capture a fugitive of American justice named Nicolas Maduro. On January 3rd, we proved to the world what our U.S. military can do. I always knew what our military can do. Many people always knew, they just never allowed them to do it. And by doing that, we inspired all kinds of things, particularly the other leaders in Latin America, to start to take the United States seriously. And the United States, everyone in Latin America knows what the Maduro regime was doing. They know how they were tied to DTOs. They know how they were moving not just cocaine, but all kinds of other things. And they had all these adversaries coming into their country. But no one was really going to do anything about it. They were just like waiting and watching, and it was getting a little worse, a little worse, a little worse. So that was a very difficult mission, but it was a mission that was carried out to precision, and I think there's a before and after. There's a January 2nd and there's a January 4th. And obviously many aspects of the mission are still classified. Obviously can't talk too much about it, but what I can say, and actually the president did show one part about it. He showed at the State of the Union, and I thought that was really important. Eric Slover, Chief Warrant Officer, who was one of the pilots of the helicopters, I thought it was really important to show the level of sacrifice that our soldiers, our military, our members are willing to do for other countries. But fundamentally, do it for other countries to defend our homeland. Right? We do it all over the world. We do it in the Middle East. I mean, I served in the Middle East. Many of you probably served in the Middle East, so those have been the privilege of wearing the uniform. And we do it in other parts that are far from home. We've never done it so close to home where it matters the most. But really, on the geopolitical level, the aftermath of that showed us many interesting things. It opened up talks with Cuba, talks that are led by President Trump and Secretary of State Marco Rubio, talks that probably wouldn't have ever been really possible, or at least taken as serious as they are right now because of what happened in Venezuela. It started to look at Nicaragua. Nicaragua started to look at this. I mean, I'll give you an anecdote. Like before, one of the problems with Nicaragua was on mass migration, and not immigration, not like actually, getting a visa, like migrate, like just moving, was that Nicaragua was becoming a visa-free transit country. They were just inviting everybody to come in the country without a visa, and then they would not have any accountability what comes in, and then they leave the country, and then we have to deal with them when they get through Mexico. And we told Nicaragua many times, like, we need to put a visa, you need to put controls on this, you need to do something about this, and they're like, yeah, great, thank you, good story, and they move on. Well, a little bit after Operation Absolute Resolve, Nicaragua put a hold on their visa-free transit. So something that we've been asking for a long time, because they started to pay attention. They say, okay, there's going to be some consequences if we still mess around. And I think fundamentally Venezuela, right? I mean, Venezuela, about a month ago, has flown the American flag at our U.S. Embassy in Caracas for the first time in about 7-8 years. We actually now have a diplomatic presence in Caracas. Our charge, our ambassador that we sent there that was a charge, stood up a U.S. embassy that's been closed for years in a matter of weeks and months. That, in diplomatic speak, is very difficult to do. And I can tell I've seen that up close. That was not easy. And the thing with Venezuela is despite perceptions, and there's all people's perceptions, and I'm curious to know what your perceptions are, but fundamentally, Venezuela is better today than it was yesterday, and it'll be better tomorrow than it was today. It's inch by inch, Venezuela is moving towards a transition. Venezuela started, and I'm in the Department of War, and we're in the stabilization side. The recovery, rebuilding side, that's concurrent, and that's happening by other agencies. I think we've had multiple agency heads, Department of Interior, Department of Energy, and others that have already visited. And now it's actually opening up, and you're getting a lot more people coming in to look at investments, and obviously the transition phase at the end. But the fundamental stabilization phase is key, because if people don't think that Venezuela is stable, investors are just not going to come. So the stabilization phase has gone very well, exceeding any expectations that I had or anyone had. It's gone remarkably well. And I think a lot of that's due to the interagency coordination and the fact that our White House leadership has really pushed this as a top priority to get there. So Venezuela's going well. That's the good news. And I'll start to wrap up and just say, like, how are we moving on the way forward? What's our look in the way forward? Well, you see a lot of things in the news about the Middle East. As long as you've been in foreign policy and national security, the Middle East is always going to be there, right? Like, you try to get away from it, it always finds a way to get you back, right? It's like that ex-girlfriend that just won't go away, right? Like, she keeps going away, but always finds a way to snap you back. But I'll tell you this, even during the most intense times of Operation Epic Fury, in the building that I work in the Pentagon, the Secretary of War would never disengage from the Western Hemisphere. At my level, we don't always talk to the secretaries historically in the building, but I talk to the secretary at least once a week because of his importance. I don't have any responsibility over the Middle East. I do have responsibilities over the Western Hemisphere, and he always wants to know what's going on in the Western Hemisphere. And I think, frankly, we have this codified now in documents. We have at the strategic level, at the White House level, you have the National Security Strategy, right? If you haven't read that document, do read that document, because it'll tell you the vision of the U.S. government, the Trump administration on national security. And at the Department of War, we have the National Defense Strategy, right? The National Defense Strategy is the Pentagon, the Department of War's strategic vision nested under that national security strategy. And in both these strategic documents, we have put the Western Hemisphere as the #1 priority of the United States. That is historic. I mean, honestly, maybe I would even say years ago, I didn't even think that was possible. And I think what we're doing now, and this is kind of just going to paint how we're looking forward, is we're kind of going back to the past. It's kind of like a back to the future exercise. Because about 230 years ago, the United States made a bet on its foreign policy. It was a young nation. It was starting to grow, starting to thrive, but after the heels of the Revolutionary War, had to still sow its footings. We weren't the most powerful military in the world. I'm talking about the early 1800s, the early 19th century. And then we had a young Secretary of War We're called the Department of War back then. We changed it after World War II, and then we're going back to that. And it's not about war. It's about peace. It's about that warfighter mentality, because the job of the military is always to give a diplomat another day. So our job is to make sure that we hit peace, but sometimes you got to do that through strength. In fact, it's probably the only way you have to do that, is through strength. But going back to the early 19th century, we had this young Secretary of War who fundamentally knew that the battle upon him in 1815 would have been the battle that defines the future of the United States. I'm referring to the Battle of New Orleans. And the reason the Battle of New Orleans was so important is because the rest of Washington wanted to look north with the Continental armies that were moving with the British in Canada, and said, look, we're going to move north because we got to secure the north. And he said, well, while you guys are looking at the north, we might want to look west and south, because I think that's where we're going to get attacked. And we did, and we engaged in that battle. And that Secretary of War won the Battle of New Orleans. Then a few years later, he culminated the War of 1812 into the Seminole Wars and won that war. Later became the Secretary of State, then became the President of the United States, and signed a doctrine in 1823 called the Monroe Doctrine. Talking about Secretary of War, Secretary of State, and President James Monroe. The story of James Monroe, and also wore the uniform. The story of James Monroe defined the Western Hemisphere more than 200 years ago today. And then we abandoned it. We left it alone. So we're going back to that posture. The Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine is going back to understanding the logic of making the Western Hemisphere once again a high priority for the United States. And at the Department of War, we're even going a little bit further by looking specifically at World War II. Because in World War II, we were forced to look at the Panama Canal in a very serious way. I haven't spent a lot of time talking about the Panama Canal, but it's very strategic. Everyone knows why it's important. But what we understood in World War II is that you have to protect the Panama Canal, not just on the canal, but around the canal. And back then in World War II, we had a homeland defense posture that carried all the way into the Arctic, both through Greenland and Alaska. You guys remember the Bluey bases in the southern part of Greenland extended to Iceland to power project into the Arctic. And then you had military bases on the Galapagos Islands and in the northern part of Brazil to look at those shipping lanes that go to the Panama Canal, because we understood that to protect, to win any war in any part of the world, you have to win in the Western Hemisphere first. And to be able to do that, you have to protect your homeland. So we created a posture for that in 1941, and now we're going back to that posture. So in the Department of War, and in closing, I'm getting the high sign to get off stage. So in closing, I'm going to say this is a commitment from President Trump, from Secretary Hegseth, from our entire leadership, Secretary Rubio. This is a commitment on the Western Hemisphere, and we're always snapping back. There's other priorities in other parts of the world that will get dealt with and they'll be attended to, but we're always going to keep our eye on the Western Hemisphere. It makes my job a lot easier because I have the complete support of our leadership. And these conferences like this, and places where you are always talking in the margins of foreign policy, will now become the centerpiece of U.S. foreign policy. So we all have to elevate this to a higher level, and I'm very pleased and honored to be able to do it today with you. So thank you again for your time and attention, and I look forward to seeing and chatting with you throughout the conference. Thank you.